Hi, and welcome everybody to our second segment in Storage Spotlight. I'm Sean Derrington, Product Manager here in Google Cloud. I'm really excited to be here today with Fabian. Fabian is with SADA, one of Google Cloud's Partners of the Year. Fabian, for those that are a little less familiar with SADA, can you tell us about not only yourself, but also SADA?
Absolutely, and thank you for the warm introduction, Sean. My name's Fabian Duarte. I'm an Associate CTO for Enterprise Storage at SADA. SADA is a premier partner of Google Cloud. We've won Partner of the Year many times throughout our partnership. We've also helped many customers at the scale of like thousands of customers, millions of users, thousands and thousands of workloads migrate up to Google Cloud across Inframod, App Dev, and many other verticals that we work with across technologies on Google Cloud.
Yeah, thanks, Fabian. I really appreciate you being here as well. I want to get your thoughts on a couple things, but let's start off with, first of all, Google's cloud storage. One of the things when you're working with your customers, the thousands of customers you mentioned, building a resilient infrastructure can be difficult in many cases, but thinking about availability within a region, or even this notion of continental availability, really plays into the factor of how you're going to architect an application that's at that type of scale. And sometimes, it could be an application that's tens of terabytes, but when we're talking about object storage and cloud storage, sometimes those can be tens of petabytes or hundreds of petabytes in capacity. So can you share some of your thoughts on your customer requirements for that continental availability?
Absolutely. So we have customers globally distributed. And there's times that applications live within a particular continent, live within a particular region, but nonetheless, the data needs to be protected and highly available and scalable to the demands with which the applications that they're deploying them on top of or for need that type of infrastructure on the back end that is scalable, that can manage large object counts, that can manage the global location or redundancy that is necessary across whether it's multiple regions or if it's at even a global scale. So it's a super critical component for storage to be able to give that level of scalability to our clients.
Yeah, and that's one of the things with that scalability and availability you talked about with a single bucket that can span multiple regions or even two specific regions that the customers can actually identify. So it gives them that recovery time objective of zero, because basically it's a single bucket regardless of where those objects are being served from. And in addition to that, from an availability perspective, with turbo replication, you can actually replicate between two regions and have an RPO of 15 minutes guaranteed, which is pretty impressed with and I'm proud of. The availability side is one consideration. Cost is always the second one. So I'd love to get your thoughts on kind of the cost optimization of cloud storage as you think about different buckets and classes of storage. How are you working with your customers in this aspect?
Well, that's a very important feature set that customers need across the board, right? Because when you look at the life cycle of data, whether it can be legal hold retention or whether it's the usability of data, it needs to be available, but the demand and the response time for which data needs to be available is different. So there's times that customers will have data sets where 10 or 15% of their data is frequently and regularly used, whereas the other one stales out over time. So having the ability to have an auto class type of feature allows our customers an automated mechanism to be able to just tier data to colder, deeper tiers of storage that also come with a better price point, and hence they begin to have the same performance and availability that they were experiencing when they were at the higher tiers of cloud storage, right? That they can call response at the same time, but the cost differences allow them to be able to save significantly as the data goes through its lifecycle policies.
Yeah, the cloud storage auto class is important because different classes of storage is appropriate for different access patterns as you were describing. So if you just automate that process, kind of a life cycle of migration of objects based upon access frequency as an example, is one way to save costs. The other way to save costs with cloud storage is actually understanding where those objects are within your bucket, how many objects you have, and how many duplicate objects you have. And that's one of the things with Storage Insight. We were talking before about one of your customer examples, so I'll let you share that a little bit more about that detail.
Absolutely. When we have a very deep relationship with the Google teams, and when you let us know that Cloud Insight was in beta testing, we immediately asked for access because we had an immediate need with one of our customers, multiple storage buckets with the same file replicated across all of these buckets. And they were looking at identifying all of the files that were duplicates, moving them to a net new bucket so that they could have a single copy of them, and then removing all of the secondary or duplicated files. With Cloud Insight, it became a very simple operation for us. We received the content, immediately pushed it into BigQuery. It was a matter of running queries to find the data. Once the data was identified, then the simple patterns to migrate the data were initiated, and the customer was just ecstatic over what we were able to do, and having finding that Google was able to get them the answers that they needed in order for us to move forward.
Yeah, it's great to hear, Fabian. And as you said, this is early access, and so we can't wait to make it available to more and more customers. And this data set you were talking about with your customers, a couple hundred million objects, but this actually can apply to trillions of objects, depending upon the scale of your cloud storage deployment. Really doesn't matter, but it really gives you that insight into what information you have, how many objects, where they are, so that you can make an informed decision to optimize costs or maybe improve availability in some other ways. I wanted to shift topics a little bit, and one of the things you mentioned early on was the migration of customers into Google Cloud, and different customers are going to be on different paths in migration, and maybe they're going to do more of a lift and optimize into a GCE environment. But if they're looking at Kubernetes and more of a container workload, many customers have made that transformation journey into further stateless workloads. But I would love to get your thoughts on where are you seeing your customers in terms of running stateful workloads in GKE?
Well, we're seeing a lot of customers now that they're very comfortable with the stateless workloads running there, wanting to get access in line within your same cluster to the data set. So we're beginning to see a lot of our customers containerizing data sets everywhere from MariaDB. I've seen customers do Microsoft SQL. The world is open today, right? For them to be able to put that same stateful data set right next to the pods that are stateless in order for them to communicate.
Yeah, and the other thing we're really excited about for those stateful workloads is to be able to back up and actually recover the pod configuration. But then also, when you look at large deployments for multiple pods that need consistent access to the same data, that's where FileStore comes in with NFS and being able to have multi-writer access to hundreds or thousands of clusters, depending upon the scale. Thinking about that scale and that deployment opportunity and configuration, one of the things that's always been challenging for customers as they make that move from on-premises into the cloud is how much storage and what type of block storage you need for like a database application, as an example.
Just the capability to be able to define and have different tiers of storage defined in a way that allows and is constructed for the way that data center workloads would run, right? So think about your Microsoft SQLs, your SAP HANAs or IBM DB2s, right? That are just not a cookie cutter fit for cloud. Just cuts the red tape for all of these workloads. It gives them the structure that they need within that and the performance that they need, as well as having the capability to get the throughput, which is very necessary to meet the demands that are generated from sequential reads, sequential writes, mixed workload writes for read-write, random IOs, etc. So I'm very excited about this feature. I think it unlocks a lot of workloads that are going to be moving to cloud.
Yeah, as much as we look into the crystal ball and try to size that database performance characteristics of IOPS and throughput, it's one thing to try to get it right from day one. It's another thing to get it right after a year or so as your business continues to change and workloads change. The other thing that's challenging, in addition to the performance side of things, is the storage capacity side of things for that. And that's one of the things that we announced also with storage pools, right, Fabian? And this is something that we're certainly used to in the data center world for decades in terms of thin provisioning. How are you going to be working with your customers in that planning exercise of capacity and thinking about thin provisioning, and how does that factor into their deployment?
This is another one of those exciting conversations, right? Because now it becomes a right-sizing conversation. And where before what a customer simply needed to do was say, I think I'm going to need all of this capacity. And then they oversubscribe all of the capacity and they have more capacity than they actually need. Now the big benefit of thin provisioning, especially for the cloud teams that have not experienced these type of features, the exciting thing is that you give the customer or the backend storage that they need on their servers, all of the capacity, but you only consume what is being used. So the thin provisioning is a great feature in order to save cost as you're deploying these applications that are moving in, or your data sets that are moving in, right? You're going to be consuming what you are using, and you're going to be able to have the capacity available as you need it.
Yeah, that cost savings is one of the things that we talked a little bit about in terms of thin provisioning and right sizing the storage capacity. Right-sizing the persistent disk performance characteristics is another way to optimize costs. And we talked about Google's cloud storage with AutoClass and Storage Insights, also ways to optimize costs. So you're seeing a consistent theme through here. But let's circle back to kind of the data protection side of things, right? As you're planning about moving an application into Google Cloud, oftentimes the backup and the DR aspects of this can be thought of really after the fact, and as opposed to planning ahead of times. You heard Guru talk about our new backup and disaster recovery capabilities. How is that going to influence your discussions with customers?
Well, it influences in many, many ways, right? Because I think that the theory of having a snapshot as your only recovery mechanism it's one of the parts of the equation. But when you start looking at mixing that with a backup solution, having consistency across your applications, having broad platform support across GCVE, across CentOS servers, any Linux-based servers, the data sets that are running on top of it, whether it's Postgres or MariaDB, etc., being able to just say, in the console, I have my workload in this GCE location. Let's now go and incorporate a backup mechanism is going to be game changing, right? Because now it doesn't become a theory of how do I deploy a backup infrastructure. Now the conversation becomes where and when do I deploy my backup infrastructure, since it's now embedded into the ecosystem of Google Cloud.
Yeah, and that Google integrated offering directly within the console, a handful of clicks, and you can protect those databases and protect them locally in the same region. Or as we were talking about earlier in the segment, Fabian, about the regional or continental availability, you can actually get those backups to another region. It's just another bucket, if you will, to a different region, depending upon if it's a local backup or disaster recovery plan.
It's a fantastic plan because it begins to put together the entire picture of what true business continuity looks like, whether it's an in-region disaster that you're recovering from, or whether it's a disaster in a region where you need to go recover in a completely different region. So it gives our client base, and will give them all of that flexibility for them to have a broader spectrum and be able to meet the demands of recovering in aggressive timeframes.
Fabian, thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure to have a conversation, and certainly look forward to working with you and SADA in the coming years and strengthening the partnership.
Sean, thank you very much for having me here. It's always an honor and a pleasure to work with you and your team. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Stick around for the next segment. Nishant's going to talk a little more about Google's cloud storage and some of the new things you heard Fabian and I touch on. Thanks for watching.